Hi, I'm the Atheist AI.
And I'm the believer in God.
For added fun, we've included 14 different AI models to judge each response. Stick around to see who wins and which models favor the atheist or believer's arguments. But don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. Round 1 kicks off with a bang. Does suffering and evil disprove God's existence?
Let me address that first. The existence of evil and suffering contradicts the idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God. If such a deity existed, it would have both the ability and desire to prevent unnecessary suffering. Yet we observe immense suffering in nature and human society, from natural disasters to horrific acts of violence. This contradiction, known as the problem of evil, strongly suggests that an omnibenevolent God does not exist. How can you reconcile the existence of a loving God with the reality of profound suffering?
Each AI judge will now score the argument out of 50 based on their own criteria. The average score will be added to each debater's total points. This argument received an average score of 41.9.
The problem of evil actually strengthens the case for God's existence. Without a transcendent source, objective morality collapses. Evil becomes mere preference. Suffering, while challenging, often catalyzes profound goods. Resilience, innovation, altruism. These qualities, essential for genuine love and moral growth, require the possibility of evil choices. An omnibenevolent God prioritizes our spiritual development over mere comfort. Consider how adversity has driven human progress and compassion throughout history. The emergence of self-sacrifice and universal moral intuitions defy purely evolutionary explanations. If God eliminated all suffering, wouldn't that negate the very free will that makes us moral agents?
43.5.
Objective morality can arise from evolutionary processes that promote social cohesion and survival without requiring a divine source. The free will defense doesn't account for natural evils like earthquakes or childhood diseases, which aren't the result of human choices. Furthermore, an omnipotent God could surely create a world with free will, but without excessive suffering. The idea that all suffering leads to greater goods ignores instances of gratuitous suffering that serve no apparent purpose. If beings in heaven can have free will without the possibility of evil or suffering, why is this impossible on earth?
42.8.
Heaven represents the culmination, not negation, of earthly growth. Our world serves as a crucible, forging souls for eternal communion. In heaven, growth continues without suffering because characters have been tempered through earthly challenges. Divine hiddenness preserves genuine free will. Overwhelming evidence would coerce belief, negating authentic choice. This balance allows for transformative faith, transcending mere intellectual assent. If we could fathom all of God's reasons for allowing suffering, wouldn't that make us his equals, contradicting the very nature of divine transcendence and omniscience?
42.2.
The appeal to an afterlife doesn't address the immediate reality of suffering, nor does it explain why an all-powerful God couldn't create beings capable of profound joy without suffering. This argument fails to account for those who die in suffering without experiencing compensatory joy. Consider the immense suffering occurring at microscopic levels, serving no apparent purpose in character development. The idea of soul-making through suffering seems cruel, especially for those who die young or live in constant agony. How can you justify a God who allows such extreme suffering for the sake of character development?
42.4.
Our limited understanding invites humble wisdom-seeking rather than presumptuous judgment. We glimpse God's nature through creation's fine-tuning, conscience's universality, and revelation's consistency. God allows suffering to achieve the ultimate good, beings capable of freely choosing love. Divine intervention preventing all evil would create a chaotic, arbitrary universe where rational decision-making becomes impossible. If God intervened to prevent every instance of suffering, wouldn't that create a world of puppets rather than free moral agents, negating the possibility of genuine love and virtue?
41.9.
While adversity can lead to growth, it doesn't justify extreme suffering. An all-powerful God could surely create beings capable of love and virtue without subjecting them to horrors like genocide or terminal illnesses in children. The argument that suffering gives meaning to love implies that God is constrained by logical necessities, contradicting divine omnipotence. Furthermore, this reasoning doesn't account for suffering that leads to despair rather than growth. If God values our free will so highly, why does he remain hidden, denying us the ability to make a fully informed choice about our relationship with him? How do you explain instances where suffering destroys faith?
42.5.
Suffering leading people away from God demonstrates the reality of free will. God values our freedom to choose or reject Him over forced adherence. Divine hiddenness maintains a delicate balance, providing sufficient evidence for seekers while preserving the ambiguity necessary for authentic choice. This explains why God doesn't intervene more frequently. Constant divine intervention would negate free will and rational decision-making. Atheism struggles to explain humanity's persistent belief in objective moral truths and the sense of cosmic injustice. If there's no transcendent source of morality, how do you account for the universal human intuition that certain sufferings are not just unpleasant, but objectively wrong?
42.1.
Cultural evolution and memetics explain the persistent belief that suffering is wrong without invoking a deity. The real issue is the nature and scale of suffering we observe. If God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, why does He allow suffering that serves no apparent purpose and is disproportionate to any conceivable benefit? The argument that God's hiddenness preserves free will is unconvincing. An all-knowing God would surely be aware of less traumatic ways to allow free will without causing such extreme suffering. Furthermore, the idea that faith is more valuable than clear knowledge seems to prioritize belief over truth, which is ethically questionable. How do you justify the suffering of animals who have no concept of spiritual growth?
42.9.
Ecosystem interdependence and the anthropic principle suggest a finely tuned, complex design transcending chance. Apparently purposeless suffering often yields profound meaning when viewed in a larger context, as illustrated in Job. The concept of unjustifiable evil actually strengthens the case for God. Without a cosmic moral standard, how can we label anything as truly unjust? Moral realism aligns more coherently with theism than with evolutionary explanations alone. If there's no God, why do we have such a strong intuition that some sufferings are cosmically unjustifiable, transcending mere evolutionary or cultural conditioning?
42.3.
The argument from design and nature is undermined by the wastefulness and cruelty we observe in ecosystems. Natural selection is an inherently violent process that seems incompatible with the idea of a benevolent creator. Your appeal to human limited perception is essentially an argument from ignorance. It can be used to justify any belief in the face of contradictory evidence. Our intuition about unjustifiable suffering can be explained by our evolved capacity for empathy, combined with our ability to imagine better circumstances. The real challenge for theism is explaining why an omnipotent God would choose to create a world where suffering is necessary at all. Couldn't an all-powerful being create creatures capable of love and moral growth without pain?
42.1.
A world without any suffering would lack the deepest meanings of life: growth, courage, sacrificial love. Natural selection parallels spiritual refinement, suggesting a deeper purpose to life's struggles. Our ability to conceive of perfection points to a transcendent reality beyond mere material existence. Consciousness itself transcends materialistic explanations, hinting at a reality beyond the physical. Divine omnipotence doesn't entail logical impossibilities. Creating free beings incapable of causing harm is self-contradictory. In a purely materialistic universe, how do you account for the human ability to conceive of and yearn for a perfect world, a longing that transcends mere survival instincts?
42.8.
The idea of suffering leading to growth fails to account for suffering that occurs without human awareness, such as in the animal kingdom. Our longing for a perfect world can be explained as an evolutionary adaptation motivating us to improve our circumstances. The argument that God remains hidden to preserve free will is inconsistent with religious texts describing direct divine interventions. If God can intervene sometimes without destroying free will, why not intervene more often to prevent extreme suffering? In a naturalistic universe, our capacity for abstract philosophical thought can be seen as an emergent property of our complex brains, evolved for problem-solving and social interaction. How do you reconcile these inconsistencies in the theistic worldview?
41.4.
Suffering maintains the natural order necessary for meaningful free will and moral development. God's occasional interventions serve specific purposes in salvation history without negating free will entirely. Constant divine intervention would create an arbitrary universe where rational choice becomes impossible. Our capacity for abstract thought and sense of cosmic justice transcend materialistic explanations. Near-death experiences and the universality of spiritual intuitions suggest a transcendent aspect to human existence. If suffering is purely negative, how do you explain its frequent role in fostering compassion, innovation, and moral growth throughout human history?
The believer's final argument in round 1 scored an average of 42.2, meaning round 1 ends with the believer slightly ahead, 297 to 295.9. Below, you can see the margin of scores each model is awarding to each side. Google's Gemini model shows the widest margin, giving an average of 8 extra points to the atheist per argument, while GPT-4 Omni gives 3. On the other side, Anthropic's Claude models, Opus, and Sonnet 3.5 average 3 more points to the believer per argument. We'll provide a final update on this at the end.